We also need to recognize that today, contrary to Helsinki Final Act principles and international law, Russia continues to threaten stability in Europe, including by violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbors.
The new U.S. ambassador to Russia, Jon Huntsman, has put Moscow on notice. He's told the Kremlin that at the top of the White House's priority list is a return of Crimea to Ukraine. Russia has supported separatists in eastern Ukraine since 2014, and the ensuing fighting has led to more than 10,000 deaths. Now, Huntsman's comments come while White House officials are under suspicion for colluding with Russia to influence the 2016 U.S. election. And while some call it a smokescreen, there's no denying the regional perception that Russia's influence is growing, whether it's next door or in the Middle East. Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Alexander Vershbow. He was the U.S. ambassador to Russia under George W. Bush and was also an assistant secretary of defense under Barack Obama, and more recently, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Sir, pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. When the new ambassador to Moscow, Jon Huntsman, says Russia should give back Crimea, should get out of the Donbass, is it easier said than done?
Well, definitely it's easier said than done, but I think Russia has to decide whether it wants to have a normal relationship with the United States and with the West again, or whether it wants to remain an international pariah state that is known for violating international law and using violence against its neighbors in violation of all the rules of the game. The Crimean situation, of course, may be especially difficult to resolve in the short term, but Putin could be put to the test right now in dealing with the eastern Ukraine situation. He recently put out a peacekeeping proposal, which everyone interprets as something of a ruse, but it could be the beginning of a bargaining process that could lead to a political solution in which the Russians would get out of the Donbass. Right. I hope that's the case, but I can't say I'm very optimistic.
Right, so yeah, you mentioned that peacekeeping proposal from Putin saying he doesn't mind, or he's willing to negotiate UN peacekeepers there. Then we also had this meeting that happened in Belgrade. Kurt Volker on the one side and Vladislav Surkov on the other. They spoke about a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. Putting those things together sounds as if Russia wants to get out maybe, but still retain a bit of a buffer. Will there be some sort of compromise? Because that would mean compromising some of Ukraine's territorial sovereign integrity. Is that possible at all?
Well, any deal would have to restore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, at least as far as the eastern Ukrainian provinces are concerned. I think the answer, though, to your question is maybe. We have to test Putin at the bargaining table. I'm very glad that the administration chose Kurt Volker, a really experienced and realistic diplomat, to lead its efforts, working with Germany, France, and, of course, with the Ukrainians themselves. We may not see any clear evidence of a breakthrough until after the Russian elections in March, after President Putin has got a new mandate under which he maybe, I repeat, maybe could be persuaded to at least hand back the Donbass and allow Ukraine to begin to live a normal life and not face the daily shelling of rockets and artillery. But again, he has to decide whether he wants to reverse his aggression. First, he has to admit that he's got his forces in there. Right now, Russia pretends it doesn't even have troops in eastern Ukraine, so it's a very difficult situation.
When General Mattis and others talk about arming Ukraine with defensive weapons, would you accept that from the Russian perspective, there's no such thing as defensive weapons? They are always going to see those as attacking weapons, as the West wanting to attack them.
Well, the Russians clearly aren't happy about the increasing talk of expanding military assistance to Ukraine. The Obama administration gave some technologies, certain radars and communications equipment, but they didn't give lethal weapons like anti-tank weapons. So I think for the Russians, they have to face the reality that if they don't negotiate a deal on the Donbass, the situation could get worse for their own forces. They could face much greater casualties if they continue to lob missiles at the Ukrainians. They're going to get hit back in the future.
Right.
And I think this might provide a little bit of an incentive for Putin to negotiate. So I'm glad the administration is at least talking about that.
Yeah, so and let's broaden this out now as I try to tap into your expertise on Russia and why Russia might do what it does. Why do you think Russia is in Syria?
Well, I think Russia's immediate goal in intervening 2 years ago in Syria was to save the Assad regime from collapse. And I think that was partly a message to the United States that we're not going to get away with a regime change operation as we did in Iraq and later in Libya. But I think Russia's ambitions have grown after the success of its initial intervention, and it's now trying to reestablish a more prominent, influential position in the broader Middle East. It's now got permanent bases, both Air Force bases and naval bases in Syria, and it's engaging more directly, as we just saw with the King of Saudi Arabia visiting Moscow, playing around in Libya. So Russia is trying to become a bit of a global power again. But there's, again, a domestic reason for this. The Russian people no longer are getting much improvement in their standard of living, so Putin's feeding them a kind of a tonic of nationalism and Russian greatness in order to divert attention from his increasing failures to deliver prosperity at home.
Okay, so the reasoning might be domestic, but I've spoken to perhaps more than a dozen experts who all tell me that with Obama wanting to be everyone's friend in the region and Trump wanting to put America first, there's a vacuum that's been created in the Middle East. Russia is filling that vacuum, and maybe Russia might not even be filling it. Maybe it already has filled it. You mentioned King Salman going to Moscow, and maybe now Putin is the indispensable player in the Middle East. Is that just a nice theory, or is that true?
I think he's more influential, but I think we shouldn't exaggerate Russia's influence overall. In terms of its power projection capability, it's really at its limits in Syria. They tried to show off their one aircraft carrier, which is totally obsolete. So they don't have the ability to project power the way the United States does. But the U.S. needs to figure out its strategy in the Middle East. I think if there's a vacuum, it's more that the U.S. is leaving the field open for Russia and its allies, such as Iran, to expand their influence. The U.S. has so prioritized fighting ISIS, which of course deserves to be crushed, but they haven't figured out what's going to happen the day after ISIS collapse, whether it's in Syria or in Iraq. Right now it looks like it's going to become a protectorate of Iran with Russian support, and leaving the U.S. On the sidelines trying to figure out what happened. So the U.S. needs a strategy, but I don't think Putin is 10 feet tall. I think the U.S. can continue to exert influence in the region if it gets its act together.
And very finally, I just want to recoil this back to the U.S. domestically. Some people believe that any tough talk on Russia from the Trump administration is just a smokescreen in order to deflect from what many in the U.S. believe is the fact that Russia meddled in the U.S. elections and helped hand the presidency to Donald Trump. What's your take on that?
No, I think the tougher talk on Russia, which has been a change. At the beginning of the administration, President Trump was still behaving in a very friendly way towards Russia. I think it reflects a greater understanding of the challenge that Russia poses, both on the ground in places like Ukraine, in Syria, but also in terms of its direct frontal assault on our democratic systems. Now, the president himself is still in a bit of denial about that. He still calls the interference stories a hoax. But Governor Huntsman, whom you just had on, all the key players in the administration, including Tillerson and Mattis, recognized that Russia directly interfered in our election. We don't know yet whether they tipped the balance or not, but it clearly was a kind of act of political aggression that we can't allow to stand. So I hope the administration ultimately will strengthen our defenses against this sort of interference and negotiate with Russia from a position of strength. Then we can get to the kind of better relationship that President Trump talked about during his campaign. It's not through concessions, but it's through strength.
Alexander Vershbow, it's been great to pick your brain on these issues. Thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.